She was cast out for her baby, until a warrior wrapped them in his cloak. The baby's first cry pierced the Sunday morning silence like a gunshot, and Martha knew her life was over. She pressed her newborn son against her chest, his tiny fists pushing against the worn cotton of her only clean dress, while the congregation inside First Baptist continued their hymn as if the world hadn't just split open on their doorstep. The wooden steps beneath her knees were rough with splinters, each one biting through her skirt like the whispers that had followed her for months. Jezebel. The word hissed from Mrs. Whitmore's lips as she emerged from the church doors, her black Sunday hat casting shadows across her pinched face. You dare bring your sin to God's house? Martha's milk-heavy breasts ached as she shifted the baby, his perfect pink mouth searching for comfort she wasn't sure she could give. 3 months ago, she'd been the schoolteacher's assistant, respected enough to sit in the third pew every Sunday, close enough to smell the preacher's wife's lavender water. Now dust clung to her unwashed hair, and her shoes had holes that let in Texas heat and judgment in equal measure. Please, Martha whispered, her voice cracking like drought-parched earth. He needs christening. He needs a father. Mrs. Whitmore's fan snapped shut with the finality of a coffin lid. And you need to learn what happens to women who spread their legs for married men. The baby whimpered against Martha's throat, and she tasted copper where she'd bitten her tongue to keep from screaming. Behind Mrs. Whitmore, other faces appeared in the doorway, the baker's wife with her perpetual scowl, old Mr. Henderson with his rheumy eyes, even sweet Mary Catherine who used to share her lunch apples. Now they all wore the same expression, like she was something that had crawled out from under a rock. Martha's legs trembled as she tried to stand, the baby's weight suddenly impossible to bear. She thought of James Ashford in his fine banker's suit, how he'd whispered promises against her ear in the schoolhouse after dark, how his hands had shaken when he told her about his wife's delicate condition. How quickly those same hands had signed the papers transferring her teaching position to his cousin from Dallas. The boys got Ashford eyes, someone muttered from the crowd, and Martha's stomach dropped like a stone down a well. She hadn't told anyone. Hadn't breathed a word about who'd fathered the child growing under her heart while she taught multiplication tables and tried to ignore the way her skirts grew tight. But eyes don't lie, and this baby had inherited more than James Ashford's gray gaze. He'd gotten his square chin and the stubborn cowlick that made his dark hair twist at the crown. Mrs. Whitmore stepped closer, her shadow falling across Martha's face like a threat. You think we're fools? Think we don't see what you've done to this town's reputation? To a good Christian man's marriage? The church doors slammed shut with a sound like thunder, and Martha found herself alone on the steps with nothing but dust and silence for company. Even the hymn singing had stopped, as if her presence had poisoned the very air inside the sanctuary. She pressed her lips to her son's soft head, breathing in his innocent smell of milk and new beginnings, and wondered how something so pure could be born from something the world called sin. The sun climbed higher, painting the church walls the color of dried blood, while Martha sat frozen on the steps like a statue built to warn other women about the price of foolish love. Her throat burned with thirst, her back ached from childbirth, and her breasts leaked milk that stained her bodice in dark circles of shame. But she couldn't move, couldn't think past the crushing weight of being cast out from the only life she'd ever known. A rattlesnake could have coiled at her feet and she wouldn't have flinched. What was one more dangerous thing in a world that had already shown its fangs? The baby's cries grew weaker as the morning stretched toward noon, his little voice growing hoarse from calling for comfort that seemed as distant as rain clouds in the merciless blue sky. Martha's milk was already starting to thin, stress and hunger were thieves that stole a mother's ability to nourish her child, and she had plenty of both. That's when she heard the hoofbeats. James Ashford rode up the dusty main street like he owned it, which he practically did, his black gelding shoes striking sparks from the packed earth. He wore his Sunday best, pressed trousers, white shirt that had never known honest sweat, and a gold watch chain that caught the light like a promise he'd never kept. Martha watched him approach with the terrible fascination of a bird watching a snake, knowing death was coming but unable to look away. He reined in his horse 20 feet from the church steps, close enough for her to see the muscle jumping in his jaw, far enough away to pretend he didn't know her. But his gray eyes, the same eyes now staring up at her from her son's perfect face, gave him away. Martha. Her name sounded like an apology he'd never make. You need to leave town. She found her voice somewhere in the depths of her breaking heart. This is your son. James Ashford looked at the baby for one long moment, and Martha saw something flicker across his face, recognition, maybe even love. But then his wife's carriage turned the corner, and his expression hardened like cooling steel. I don't know what you're talking about, he said loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. But I know what you are. Martha's milk dried up on the fourth day of walking, her body giving up its last gift to her son just as the sun reached its cruel peak above the endless Texas plains. She pressed her fingers to her breast, feeling the hollow ache where life-giving warmth had been, and knew she was watching her baby die one breath at a time. His cries had grown thin as paper, weak as wind through wheat, and his perfect little fingers felt cold even in the blazing heat. The road to nowhere stretched ahead like a promise God never meant to keep. Behind her, Clearwater Creek grew smaller with each stumbling step, its church bells and judgmental whispers fading into memory. Ahead lay only dust and desperation, and the wild country where decent folk said the Apache still painted their faces with war colors and scalped white women for sport. But decent folk had cast her out to die, so maybe savages would show more mercy. Her feet bled inside her worn boots, each step leaving dark spots on the hard-pan earth. The baby's weight seemed to double every mile, though she knew he was actually growing lighter, his little body using itself up like a candle burning down to nothing. She tried giving him water from her cupped palms at the last creek crossing, but he was too weak to swallow, and most of it just ran down his chin like tears he was too tired to cry. The buzzards started following them on the third day. Big black shapes wheeling overhead, patient as death itself. Martha knew what they were waiting for, and the knowledge sat in her stomach like a stone. She'd heard stories of women who'd walked into the desert to spare their families shame, leaving nothing behind but bones picked clean by scavengers and a cautionary tale whispered around dinner tables. But she kept walking. The sun was setting like a blood-red wound across the western sky when she saw the smoke rising from behind a line of red rock hills. Not the black smoke of a prairie fire, but the thin gray ribbon that spoke of cook fires and human hands feeding flames. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she changed direction, following the smoke like a moth drawn to light that might burn her alive. She knew what lay beyond those hills. The Apache reservation, where the army had penned up the last free warriors like cattle, trying to turn hunters into farmers and prayers into Christian hymns. White folks in Clearwater Creek spoke of it in whispers, crossing themselves when they mentioned the heathens who still practiced their devil magic under the government's nose. Children were warned never to wander too close to the reservation boundaries, lest they be stolen away and raised as one of the savage tribe. But Martha was already stolen from everything she'd ever known, and her son was already dying in her arms. What did she have left to lose? The first stars were pricking holes in the purple sky when she stumbled over the ridge and saw the lights below. Not the neat rows of a proper town, but scattered cook fires glowing like fallen stars around low adobe buildings and canvas tents. The air smelled different here, wood smoke and roasting meat, sage and something else she couldn't name. Something wild and clean that made her city-raised lungs burn with longing. She was halfway down the slope when she heard the footsteps behind her. Martha spun around, her legs nearly giving out as she clutched her silent baby to her chest. A man stepped from the shadows between two boulders, moving with the liquid grace of a mountain cat. He was tall and lean, his dark hair bound with leather and feathers, his chest bare except for a necklace of what looked like animal claws. Paint streaked his cheekbones in blue and white lines, and his eyes caught the starlight like chips of black obsidian. A rifle hung loose in his hands, not quite pointed at her but not exactly friendly either. Martha tried to speak and found her voice had fled along with her courage. The man, the warrior, for that's what he had to be, tilted his head and studied her with the intensity of a hawk watching a wounded rabbit. She waited for him to raise the rifle, to put her out of her misery with quick frontier justice. Instead, he spoke one word in accented English that sounded like gravel and honey mixed together. Lost. It wasn't a question. Martha nodded anyway, tears finally coming now that she had an audience for her breaking. My baby, she whispered, holding out her son like an offering to an indifferent god. He's dying. The warrior stepped closer, and Martha caught his scent, leather and horse and something that reminded her of thunderstorms. His eyes moved from her face to the bundle in her arms, and she saw something flicker there. Recognition, maybe. Or memory of his own losses. He reached out with one long-fingered hand, not to take her child but to touch the baby's forehead with surprising gentleness. His skin was warm and calloused, marked with small scars that spoke of battles fought and survived. When he pulled his hand away, he looked at his fingertips for a long moment, as if reading some message written there in sweat and fever. Ayanna, he said, and Martha didn't know if it was a name or a prayer. She will know. He turned and started walking toward the lights below, pausing after a few steps to look back at her. His meaning was clear enough: follow or die alone on this hillside. Martha took a shaking breath that tasted of sage and possibility, looked down at her son's still face, and made the choice that would change everything. She followed the warrior into the darkness, toward whatever waited in the firelight below. Behind her, the buzzards called to each other like mourners at a funeral that might not happen after all. The warrior led Martha through a maze of shadows and firelight, past faces that turned to watch their strange procession with eyes like carved stone. Old women paused their weaving to stare, children peeked out from behind their mothers' skirts, and men touched the knives at their belts with careful fingers. Martha clutched her dying son closer, feeling the weight of their suspicion like a physical thing pressing against her chest. But none of them spoke, and none of them tried to stop the warrior as he guided her toward a low adobe building where yellow light spilled from an open doorway. The smell of burning sage grew stronger with each step, mixed with something medicinal and sharp that made Martha's empty stomach clench with hope and fear in equal measure. Nailnish. An old woman's voice drifted from inside the building, speaking the warrior's name like a mother calling her son home for supper. You bring death to my door. The warrior, Nailnish, stopped just outside the threshold and spoke in rapid Apache, his voice low and urgent. Martha caught her own name in the flow of unfamiliar words, and something that sounded like child and fever. The baby's breathing had grown so shallow she had to press her ear to his chest to hear his heartbeat, quick and thready as a trapped bird's wings. Bring her, the woman said in English, and Nailnish stepped aside to let Martha enter. The interior of the adobe house felt like stepping into another world. Dried herbs hung from the rafters in bundled clusters, filling the air with the scent of wild mint and mysterious roots. Clay pots lined wooden shelves, each one carefully stoppered and labeled with symbols Martha couldn't read. In the center of the room, an old Apache woman knelt beside a fire pit, her silver hair braided with feathers and beads that caught the flame's dancing light. This had to be Ayanna. She was ancient, her face mapped with wrinkles that spoke of decades under the desert sun, but her dark eyes were sharp as obsidian arrowheads. She wore a dress of soft deerskin decorated with intricate beadwork, and around her shoulders was draped a magnificent cloak, deep blue wool with silver threads that sparkled like captured starlight. The most beautiful thing Martha had ever seen, and clearly precious beyond measure. Show me the child, Ayanna commanded, and Martha knelt beside the fire with trembling legs. The old woman's hands were gentle as she unwrapped the baby from his makeshift blankets, her fingers moving with the confidence of someone who had delivered and healed countless children over her long years. She pressed her ear to his chest, touched his forehead, pulled down his lower eyelid to examine the pale flesh beneath. Martha watched every movement, hardly daring to breathe. Thirst, Ayanna said finally. And the hunger that comes when mothers have no milk. She looked at Martha with eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. You walked far. For days, Martha whispered. Maybe 5. I lost count. Ayanna nodded as if this explained everything. She rose gracefully despite her age and began pulling jars from her shelves, mixing herbs and powders in a small clay bowl. The fire crackled and popped, sending shadows dancing across the walls like spirits celebrating some ancient ritual. Martha felt Nailnish's presence behind her, solid and warm as a mountain wall. "This will help," Ayana said, returning with a bowl of dark liquid that smelled of earth and growing things. "But first, he needs warmth. Life calls to life, and his flame burns too low." Without ceremony, the old woman lifted her precious cloak from her shoulders and wrapped it around Martha and the baby both, cocooning them in its soft warmth. The wool was finer than anything Martha had ever touched, woven with a skill that spoke of generations of tradition. She could feel the baby's cold skin beginning to warm against her chest, and something deeper than heat seemed to flow from the cloak into their joined bodies. "Nailnish," Ayana spoke to the warrior without looking away from Martha's face. "This woman has been cast out by her people. Why do you bring her to mine?" Martha felt rather than saw the warrior move closer. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Because the Apache know what it means to be hunted. To have nowhere left to run." The old woman studied Martha's face in the firelight, taking in the hollow cheeks and desperate eyes, the worn dress and bleeding feet. "Your man?" she asked. "He refuses the child." "He's married to someone else," Martha said, the words scraping her throat raw. I was foolish. Believed his promises." Ayana's expression softened slightly. "Men make promises like morning mist. Beautiful, but gone when the sun rises." She dipped a cloth in the herbal mixture and squeezed drops between the baby's lips. "What is his name?" "The child?" Martha realized with a shock that she hadn't named her son yet. In all the chaos of birth and judgment and fleeing, she'd simply called him, baby, in her mind. I don't know. I thought." She swallowed hard. "I thought I'd have time to decide." "Time," Ayana repeated, as if the word amused her. "Time is a luxury the desperate cannot afford." She continued feeding the baby drops of medicine, her movements patient as falling rain. "Among my people, children are often named for the circumstances of their birth." What marked his arrival? Martha thought of the church steps, the slammed doors, the judgment in every eye that looked upon her. "Shame," she whispered. "Everyone said he was born from shame." Nailnish made a sound low in his throat, not quite anger, not quite sorrow. "Shame is what others feel when they look in a mirror and see their own sins reflected back." He moved into Martha's line of sight, his painted face serious in the firelight. "This child was born from love. Foolish love, perhaps, but love nonetheless." The baby stirred against Martha's chest, his tiny mouth working as Ayana's medicine took hold. His breathing seemed deeper now, less labored, and when he opened his eyes they were clearer than they'd been in days. Martha felt tears spill down her cheeks as hope bloomed in her chest like desert flowers after rain. "He will live," Ayana announced with quiet certainty. "But you both need rest, food, and healing. The desert takes its toll on those who walk unprepared." Martha started to protest that she had no money, no way to pay for such kindness, but Ayana waved her words away like smoke. "The cloak will stay with you tonight," the old woman said, settling back on her heels. "It has medicine in its weaving, protection for mothers and their young. My grandmother made it for me when I birthed my first son." Her eyes grew distant with memory. "The soldiers killed him when he was 23. But the cloak remembers what it means to shelter new life." Outside, coyotes began their evening song, their voices rising and falling like grief made audible. Martha pulled the miraculous cloak tighter around herself and her son, feeling strength flow back into her weary bones. The baby's skin grew warm and pink, his breathing steady as a sleeping cat's. But even as relief flooded through her, Martha couldn't shake the feeling that this peace was temporary. She was still a white woman on an Apache reservation, still carrying a child that marked her as fallen in the eyes of civilized society. And somewhere behind them in Clearwater Creek, there would be men with badges and Bibles who wouldn't rest until they dragged her back to face their version of justice. Nailnish seemed to read her thoughts. "Sleep now," he said quietly. "Tomorrow brings its own troubles. Tonight, you are safe." But as Martha drifted toward exhausted sleep in the Cloak's protective embrace, she couldn't help wondering what price such safety might demand, and whether she was strong enough to pay it. Martha woke to the thunder of hoofbeats and the acrid smell of torches cutting through dawn's first light. She clutched her son to her chest, the baby warm and breathing steady against her heart, while outside Ayana's adobe walls the sound of approaching riders grew louder like an oncoming storm. The miraculous cloak still wrapped around them both, its silver threads catching the firelight as if trying to weave protection from starlight and prayer. "They come for you," Nailnish said from the doorway, his voice calm as deep water over stone. He'd painted fresh war stripes across his cheeks during the night, black and red lines that transformed his face into something primal and dangerous. His rifle rested easy in his hands, but Martha could see the tension coiled in his shoulders like a rattlesnake preparing to strike. Through the open door, she counted 12 riders spread in a loose line across the desert floor, their torches guttering in the morning breeze like angry stars. At their head rode Marshal Pete Sullivan, his silver badge catching the light as he raised his hand to halt his men just outside the reservation boundary. Even from a distance, Martha could see the rope coiled around his saddle horn, and her mouth went dry as alkali dust. "She's in there somewhere," Sullivan's voice carried across the desert air, loud enough for the whole Apache camp to hear. "White woman named Martha Caldwell, traveling with a bastard child. She's wanted for abandoning her Christian duties and consorting with savages." Ayana spat into the fire, sending sparks spiraling toward the smoke hole. "Christian duties," she muttered in Apache, then switched to English for Martha's benefit. "Is that what they call casting out mothers and babies now?" Martha started to rise, her legs shaking with more than exhaustion. "I should go. I won't bring trouble to your people." Nailnish's hand fell on her shoulder, gentle but immovable as granite. "You will stay." His dark eyes met hers, and she saw something there that made her breath catch, not just protection, but possession. The look of a man who'd claimed something precious and would die before giving it up. "They want to take you back to their justice. I have seen what white man's justice does to women like you." He was right, and they both knew it. Martha had heard the whispers in town about other fallen women, Sarah Mackenzie who drowned herself in the creek rather than face the shame, Rebecca Hall who'd been locked away in her father's root cellar until she went mad from isolation. The rope on Marshal Sullivan's saddle wasn't just for show. "But I'm not your responsibility," Martha whispered, though part of her desperate heart wished otherwise. "You don't know me. Don't owe me anything." Nailnish's scarred hand moved to touch the baby's downy head, his fingers incredibly gentle for a man who wore war paint like other men wore Sunday clothes. "Among my people," he said quietly, "when someone places their life in your hands, they become part of your story. You walked into my territory dying. I chose to help you live. That makes you mine to protect." The baby stirred in Martha's arms, making the small hungry sounds that meant he'd be wanting milk soon. Ayana had given Martha herbs to help restore her flow, but it would take time they might not have if Sullivan decided to cross onto reservation land with his rope and his righteous anger. "Nailnish." The old woman's voice cut through their whispered conversation like a blade through silk. "Show them why the army fears to come too close to our fires." The warrior's smile was sharp as broken glass. He moved to a wooden chest in the corner and pulled out items that made Martha's blood run cold, a knife with a handle carved from bone, a tomahawk whose blade gleamed with fresh oil, and a necklace strung with what looked suspiciously like human teeth. But when he turned back to her, his eyes were still gentle despite the fearsome tools of war adorning his body. "Do not be afraid," he said, though Martha's heart was hammering like a trapped bird. "These are just reminders. Sometimes men need to remember what respect looks like." He stepped outside into the growing daylight, and Martha watched through the doorway as he walked toward the reservation boundary with the unhurried confidence of a man who owned the ground beneath his feet. The other Apache emerged from their dwellings like shadows given form, warriors with rifles and painted faces, women with children clutched close, old men whose eyes held memories of when this land knew no boundaries or masters. Marshal Sullivan's horse pranced sideways as Nailnish approached, the animal sensing the danger its rider was too proud to acknowledge. "You speak English, boy?" Sullivan called out, his voice carrying the lazy arrogance of a man who'd never faced real consequence for his words. "I speak many languages," Nailnish replied, stopping just inside the reservation line. "Death. War. Blood. Which would you prefer?" The marshal's hand moved to his sidearm, but stopped when he noticed the 24 Apache warriors who'd materialized among the rocks and scrub brush, their rifles trained on his small posse. "I'm looking for a white woman." "Martha Caldwell. We know she came this way." "Many people come this way," Nailnish said mildly. "Most leave. Some don't." "Which kind of visitor do you plan to be?" Martha held her breath as she watched the standoff unfold. She could see Sullivan's jaw working as he calculated odds and consequences. 12 men against 20 or more, on unfamiliar ground, with an angry Apache warrior who clearly wasn't impressed by badges or bluster. The mathematics of survival were simple enough for even a fool to understand. But pride made men stupid, and Sullivan had plenty of both. "That woman is a disgrace to Christian womanhood," he declared. "She needs to face judgment for her sins." "Whose judgment?" Nailnish asked, and something in his voice made the marshal's horse take another step backward. "Yours. Your God's. Or the judgment of men who created the sin they now want to punish." The baby chose that moment to cry, a thin, hungry wail that carried across the desert silence like an accusation. Martha saw Sullivan's head turn toward the sound, his eyes narrowing as he tried to locate its source. She pressed her son closer to her chest, but his cries only grew stronger, demanding the nourishment her body was still struggling to provide. "She's here," Sullivan said with ugly satisfaction. "Hand her over, and we'll leave peaceful like." Nailnish's laugh was soft and terrible. "Peace," he repeated. "You ride onto my land with torches and rope, demand I surrender someone under my protection, and call that peace?" He shifted his weight slightly, and suddenly he looked less like a man and more like a predator choosing its moment to strike. "I have a different word for what you're offering." Martha watched in fascination and terror as the warrior who'd been so gentle with her dying child transformed into something primal and deadly. The bone knife appeared in his hand as if by magic, its edge catching the morning light like a promise of violence. But even as he prepared for battle, she remembered the tenderness of his touch on her son's fevered brow, the careful way he'd helped Ayanna administer medicine in the dark hours before dawn. Blood on his hands, tenderness in his heart. A man capable of both healing and killing, depending on what the moment demanded. And right now, the moment was demanding everything he had. The standoff stretched like a bowstring pulled to its breaking point, 12 mounted men facing 20 Apache warriors across a line drawn in desert sand and decades of blood. Martha pressed her face to the window crack in Ayanna's adobe wall, watching Nailnish stand perfectly still while Marshal Sullivan's hand hovered over his gun like a man wrestling with his own mortality. The baby's cries had faded to exhausted whimpers against her chest, but the sound had given away their location as surely as smoke signals. "Last chance, savage," Sullivan called out, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. "Hand over the woman and her bastard, or we'll come in and take them." Nailnish tilted his head like a wolf studying prey. "You are welcome to try. But understand, the moment your horse steps across this line, you become raiders on Apache land. And we remember what to do with raiders." Martha's throat went dry as she watched the marshal's face cycle through calculations of pride and survival. Behind him, his men shifted nervously in their saddles, their horses sensing the tension that crackled through the morning air like lightning before a storm. These weren't army cavalry trained for fighting Indians, they were shopkeepers and farmers playing at being lawmen, and they knew it. But Sullivan had come too far to back down without losing face in front of half the territory. His hand closed around his pistol grip, and Martha saw the exact moment when talking ended and dying began. "Take them," Sullivan barked, spurring his horse forward across the reservation boundary. The world exploded into gunfire and war cries. Martha threw herself over her baby as bullets shattered the adobe wall above their heads, sending chunks of dried mud raining down like hail. Through the chaos of gunshots and screaming horses, she heard Nailnish's voice rise in a battle cry that seemed to come from the throat of the desert itself, wild and primal and utterly without mercy. Ayanna grabbed Martha's arm with surprising strength. "Come. There is another way." The old woman led them through a hidden passage that opened behind her medicine shelves, into a narrow canyon that wound between red rock walls like a secret written in stone. Martha stumbled after her, clutching her son while bullets whined overhead and men died in the growing daylight behind them. The sound of battle faded as they climbed deeper into the maze of stone, but Martha's heart kept hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. They emerged onto a high ledge that overlooked the entire conflict below. Martha could see the Apache warriors moving like ghosts among the rocks, their superior knowledge of the terrain turning Sullivan's charge into a deadly trap. 3 of the marshal's men were already down, their horses running riderless across the desert while their riders leaked life into the thirsty sand. "They will win," Ayanna said matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. "But more will come. Always, more come." Martha knew she was right. Even if Nailnish and his warriors drove off Sullivan's posse, the territorial government would send soldiers next time. Real soldiers with cannons and orders to pacify the reservation permanently. Her presence here had lit a fuse that would burn until everything she'd grown to love was reduced to ashes. "I have to leave," she said, the words tasting like copper and defeat. "This is my fault. I won't let them destroy your people because of me." Ayanna's weathered hand found Martha's cheek, surprisingly gentle. "Child, destruction was already coming. The white man's hunger for our land grows stronger every year. You simply gave them an excuse to show their true faces sooner." Below them, Marshal Sullivan's voice rose above the gunfire, hoarse with desperation. "Fall back. Fall back to Devil's Canyon." Martha watched the surviving members of the posse retreat in disarray, their torches scattered and forgotten in the sand. But Sullivan himself remained mounted, his horse prancing in circles as he shouted challenges at the Apache warriors who melted back into the rocks like morning mist. "This isn't over," the marshal screamed, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "That woman is an abomination in the sight of God. She'll face judgment, one way or another." That's when Martha saw Nailnish step out from behind a boulder, blood streaking his chest from a bullet graze but very much alive. He walked toward Sullivan with the calm confidence of a man who knew the outcome of every fight before it started, his bone knife glinting in the rising sun. "You want her so badly?" Nailnish called out, loud enough for his voice to carry up to Martha's hiding place. "Then face me for her. One man, one blade. Winner takes all." Martha's blood turned to ice water. She scrambled to her feet, nearly dropping her baby in her haste. "No," she whispered, then louder, "no." But her voice was lost in the wind that moaned between the rock walls like the ghosts of all the women who'd been fought over and died for men's honor. Below, Sullivan was sliding down from his horse, his own knife appearing in his hand like he actually believed he had a chance against a warrior who'd been trained to kill since childhood. Martha pressed the baby into Ayanna's arms and ran. She half fell down the steep path that led back to the desert floor, her worn boots slipping on loose stones and her skirts tangling around her legs. Behind her, Ayanna's voice called out in Apache, warnings or blessings, Martha couldn't tell. All she knew was that 2 men were about to die over her choices, and she couldn't bear the weight of either death. She burst out of the rocks just as Nailnish and Sullivan began circling each other like wolves, their blades catching the light as they tested each other's guard. The surviving members of Sullivan's posse had retreated to a safe distance, unwilling to interfere in what honor demanded be settled blade to blade. "Stop!" Martha's voice cracked like a whip across the desert silence. "Both of you, just stop." Nailnish's dark eyes found her face, and for a moment his warrior's mask slipped enough to show the man beneath, tender and fierce and utterly devoted to protecting what he'd claimed as his own. Sullivan's gaze was harder, filled with the righteous fury of a man who'd convinced himself that God was on his side. "This ends now," Martha said, stepping between them with her chin raised high despite the fear that threatened to buckle her knees. "I'll go with Marshal Sullivan." "Willingly." "No more blood needs to be spilled." "No." Nailnish's voice was soft but absolute. "You belong here now. With me. With us." Martha's heart broke a little more with each word. She looked at this warrior who'd saved her life and her son's, who'd wrapped them in protection and asked nothing in return except the chance to call them his own. She thought of Ayana's gentle hands and healing wisdom, of the cloak that still smelled like sage and safety. Then she looked at Marshal Sullivan with his rope and his hatred, at the future that waited for her in Clearwater Creek, shame, punishment, and a slow death of the spirit if not the body. Some choices weren't between right and wrong. They were between the life you were given and the life you were brave enough to claim. Martha reached up and pulled the pins from her hair, letting it fall loose around her shoulders like a banner of defiance. She walked to Nailnish's side and took his free hand in both of hers, feeling the calluses that spoke of honest work and the scars that told stories of survival. "I choose him," she said simply, her voice carrying across the desert like a prayer finally answered. "I choose love over judgment. Mercy over law. A future over a past that never wanted me anyway." Sullivan's face went purple with rage, but before he could speak, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed from the canyon mouth. Army cavalry this time, their blue uniforms and brass buttons glinting in the strengthening sun. Too many to fight, too well armed to bluff. But as Martha stood with her chosen family, Nailnish with his warrior's heart, Ayana with her healing wisdom, and her son with James Ashford's gray eyes and an Apache grandmother's protection, she felt something she'd never known before. Peace. Not the kind that came from following rules or meeting expectations, but the deep, bone-deep satisfaction of finally being exactly where she belonged. The soldiers could come. The world could judge. But some fires, once lit, burned too bright for any wind to extinguish. And Martha Caldwell was finally ready to burn.